So welcome to today's creative conversation. We're hugely excited about it. Education Scotland, who fund us through the Creative Learning Networks, so grateful for that anytime, but we're particularly grateful for that today and for the next conversation, which we have scheduled for the 28th of this month, because we're doing two conversations around COP26. That's how important we think the occasion is. That's how vital it is, we think, that we begin to tackle the climate emergency and that we do all we can to make a difference as far as climate and the environment are concerned. We're equally delighted that we've been funded and also that we've got our first creative catalyst for today. I'm going to introduce each of our catalysts in turn. Our first one's Mary Michel. And Mary, I love the bio that's up on one of the websites for Mary, where it tells us that her academic background is in the philosophy of sustainable thinking. Now, who knew that that was an option? If I'd known that, I would have done that too. I'd have been in the philosophy of sustainable thinking too. But she's not just an academic. Mary worked for Goldsmiths. She looked after all of their ethical sourcing. She dealt with their programs for education. She did all sorts of work with them. But since then, she's established Ostrero, and I'm hugely impressed by that, because that organisation closes the link for us between today's themes and our overall theme of creativity. Ostrero is a wonderful organisation, I think. It's a research group, it's an advocacy group, and it's advancing ideas around the circular economy. And that's a vital element in any strategies that we adopt to try to tackle climate change. And Mary, despite all of that, has had enough sustainable thinking to find the time to be involved in work around COP26. And Mary's going to talk us through that and more generally through what she does with Ostrero. And as I say, please, questions, comments in the chat while she speaks. If there's anything urgent, we'll pick that up with Mary before we move on to our other contributors. Mary, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, David, for the lovely introduction, and hi everyone. It's really nice to be here and to be part of this conversation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we do in schools around creative learning and the environment, and for us specifically around the circular economy, and to tell you a bit about the work we've been doing on COP26. But as David said, please do come in with any questions as I go. I think David will, or somebody will, give a little shout if there's something on the chat, because I'm not very good at multitasking. So Making Circles is our educational programme, and we set it up because the aim of Ostrero is to grow the circular economy in Scotland. We want everyone to understand the story of the circular economy, how it can be a really good practical framework for addressing the climate emergency, and how it can be really beneficial to organisations, to people and to planet. So we want people to understand what it is, why it's a good thing, and how they themselves can get involved with that day to day. So the workshops that we run are all about giving a big picture, showing the really big picture of why we need change and why we need urgent change. But then the skills that we develop in the half-day workshops are skills for life around how you can rethink designing, making, using and disposing of products. And then at the end of each session, we do a short section called Go Circular, which is all about really tiny day-to-day tips for things you can do to cut out waste at home or at school. So right down to what you have in your packed lunch or how you wrap your Christmas presents. So tiny things. So the idea is that you have the big picture thinking, you have skills for life, and then you have very small day-to-day, easily implementable things to take home with you. So I'll just talk you through what we do and why we set it up. So we realised when we were looking at the circular economy that there's so much jargon around the circular economy specifically, and also around sustainability. And especially I think right now around COP26, there's a lot of greenwashing you hear all the time on the news, and it's difficult to differentiate between what's actually really useful to do and what it just sounds good to say you're doing. So we wanted to fill that gap slightly by going in, working with young people on this and getting them to become really fluent in what the circular economy is and how it can work. So since 2018, we've been running workshops right over Scotland. So we've gone as young as primary 2, but really the ideal for us is probably about primary 4 up to S3. And we've worked with young people from Dumfries and Galloway in the borders right up to Mull and Fort William and Aberdeenshire, all over Scotland. That's obviously changed somewhat in COVID, but I will come on to that in a minute because that's meant our whole offer has had temporarily to go online. So we set it up, as I said, because we wanted everyone to understand what the circular economy is and how it can be this very practical framework for addressing the climate emergency. At the same time as that, David said, I used to work with the Incorporation of Goldsmiths, so it was working with lots of designers, makers, creatives. And with Lorna MacDonald from the City of Edinburgh Council, the creative learning team there, we'd worked on a creative learning resource called Silver of the Stars. And as we worked with children, we realised that there were lots and lots of very basic hand skills that children just were not getting the opportunity to learn. And we all know they love to sit on their Xboxes or sit on the phone using very different hand skills. We were finding there were children that couldn't tie a bow, couldn't thread a needle, they couldn't cut in a straight line. And this was underlined just at the time we were setting up Making Circles by a report from the Edge Foundation and the professor of surgery at Imperial College in London, who was very aptly called Professor Kneebone, which I thought was the best name ever for professor of surgery, came out with this report saying they were seeing these absolutely academically brilliant young people coming in to do surgery, but they found that they couldn't thread a needle and they couldn't cut in a straight line. So they'd lost these very, very basic hand skills that before we all took for granted. So another reason behind setting up Making Circles was trying to give young people that very hands-on creative making experience. And that's partly because those skills are important in themselves, and also because in a circular economy, we'll need to understand how things are made, how to take them apart and how to be able to fix them and properly disassemble them for ourselves. So those skills become all the more important. So what actually is the workshop? Well, we worked with teachers, and again, I worked with Lorna, thank you Lorna, at City of Edinburgh Council, to make sure that it really fitted in with the curriculum for excellence and what teachers wanted. The last thing we wanted was to have something that was kind of imposed on teachers and that was actually a hassle to do, and it didn't fit in with what they were already doing. So we worked really hard to make sure that it ticked lots of boxes for what teachers were expected to do anyway and fit in with the curriculum for excellence. We were very aware of climate anxiety amongst young people, and I think this might be something that we'll all talk about as the conversation develops today, but that sense that there's so much bad news out there. I mean, at the moment you only need to open a paper, turn on your TV or switch on your phone and it's right there. It's end of the world stuff. It can be really anxiety inducing. And at the same time as that, there's a sense that all the responsibility is on young people, a sense that the young people all sort it out, we've made a mess, but luckily the next generation can come in and fix this. And that too, I think, is very anxiety inducing. It's saying to young people, okay, we've messed it up, it's up to you to fix this, and we as adults can't fix it. So we were really aware when we went in that we wanted to have a very open discussion that would make people want to change, but at the same time not fill them with horrific fear and anxiety. So that's why we came up with these 3 layers of the big picture. So we start off with what is the circular economy and why do we need it? And in that we look at some local stories about things that have happened to wildlife in Scotland through the waste that we produce, or differences to climate through the way that we buy, use and dispose of products. So we have quite localized stories to demonstrate that, but in the hope that it shows the big picture. We then talk about designing things differently. So if you started to think about designing out waste at the design stage, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation estimate that you could cut out 80% of waste in the final product. So there really is a lot that can be done if you start thinking about this right from the beginning. So we go through with the young people the 5 principles that we've brought together for the workshop of circular design. We have a professional designer maker as part of the workshop, talking about how they work, how they design, and how they try to design out waste. And on the table in front of us, we fill the table with absolutely gorgeous materials and products and tools for the young people to use. So the idea is that they are transforming waste to value. What we use are waste products, but they're really, really nice high-end waste products. So we're not talking about the cereal boxes and the milk cartons that come back in sculptures. I have many of those in my own home from my children. But we're talking about really beautiful end-of-line things. So, for example, fabrics or lanyard materials, bits of wetsuits that get made by factories and then just chucked away. And part of that is showing how these really high quality, beautiful, still useful products are just being chucked onto the rubbish heap. And the other part is trying to get the young people to design and make something that they're really proud of. So it's not rubbish, it's something that really has a use and that still has aesthetic, pleasing quality to it. We also talk about designing for disassembly. So the idea is making something that can be easily taken apart again so that you can update it, you could repair it, and at the end of its life as that product you can properly disassemble it to properly recycle and reuse all the bits, not just chuck them away. So the young people are not allowed to use any glue or sellotape, which is always a bit of a hard one. You can hear the kind of intake of breath when it's like no glue or sellotape allowed. But what we did was we came up with lots of different ways of fixing things together. So we use these cool things called super clips, and we developed little blocks of wood and bradles so that people can make their own holes in things and fix them together in lots and lots of different ways. And that's been really great because it actually gets people really thinking about why are things fixed together in a certain way. And of course, so much of what we use today is fixed together so that you can't take it apart and reuse it, so that you have to buy a new one. And the act of actually thinking that through, designing it on paper and then making it for themselves, making those holes, making the fixings, really helps to cement the learning. So it's not just somebody telling you that, as sorry to say I am just now, but they're actually doing it for themselves. And that does, I think, really help to make that message real to them, not just something that someone's telling them to do. So they work in groups of 4 or 5. They come up with their own prototype for a circular model with no waste. And then at the end of the session, each group shares what they've made with the others and talks about how it's circular. So what's been really nice about that, some of the outcomes, are the reaction from children and from teachers. We've had several classes that didn't want to go out for break, which was really nice, and the teachers being amazed because the kids just wanted to stay in and get on with what they were doing. We also found, which was an unexpected outcome, that it really appealed to children who the teachers usually found difficult to engage. So there were a couple of times when we went into schools and we were told, so-and-so won't take part in this, he'll just stay on this, he won't be interested. Then they would start making. And there was one boy I remember up in the Highlands, and he sat for 2 hours making this beautiful pair of glasses out of wire, amazing, with lenses that could change so that you would keep the pair of glasses for life and you would just change the lenses. And at break time, we went into the staff room and the teaching assistant showed the photos she'd taken to the other teachers. And they all couldn't believe it was this boy, because they said that normally he's wreaking havoc in the classroom and not really paying attention and moving around. They couldn't believe that he'd sat there for the whole morning, really carefully painstakingly making these glasses. So that was a very nice unintended consequence that we saw happening in lots of different schools. Other outcomes were the understanding of what the circular economy is, and then trying to implement that day to day in the school. So as I said, we have this section at the end called Go Circular, where children come up with their own ideas for what they might do at home or at school. So it might be things like a swap shop for costumes around Halloween or World Book Day, or it might be around, as I said before, your packed lunches, or lots of different very, very easy ways to cut out waste that often also save money. At the end of each academic year, we've had an exhibition with the National Museums of Scotland. So the first one was a physical exhibition. The last 2 have both been online because of COVID. And we also had to change our workshops. Obviously, when lockdown happened, we couldn't get into schools anymore. So we created an online resource called Making Circles Online, where we made films of the makers that we work with creating pieces, and young people can make alongside the makers, a bit like Blue Peter style. So that's been good, but it's not nearly as good as being there in person, because you lose the creativity. They're making something to a pattern rather than coming up with their own ideas and making their own thing. And the exhibitions, we had one coming up just when lockdown hit. So we decided we couldn't just go ahead with an exhibition that didn't reference this enormous change that we were all going through in lockdown. So we created a new section in it called Build Back Better, and we went back to all the schools that we'd worked with, and we asked the young people what they thought was good that was happening in lockdown that could help us build a circular economy or a more sustainable future after COVID. And I will put the links up after this to these exhibitions so that you can see them. But there were 5 sections. They had fresh air for all, making things last, a mindset for change, stronger communities, and making the most of technology. So one example was Thomas, who was in primary 4, and he said, people need to be careful with nature. The air is cleaner because there are no planes. All animals are now getting a chance. So that's just one example of what we had, but it was lots and lots of quotes from children about what they thought was good in lockdown. And it was actually really nice to work on. And lots of teachers came back to say they'd enjoyed that positive take on it, because it was obviously otherwise such a negative time for everyone. Our latest exhibition, which just opened this time last week, online again with National Museum Scotland, is around COP26. And we asked children this time, what do you think world leaders should prioritise at COP26? So they could say anything they wanted, but we found that the answers fell into 3 main categories, although there were obviously answers outside that too. Energy was the first, the second was the design, the use and the disposal of products, and the third was plants and wildlife. So one example from that was Amelia in primary 6. And she said, I think the most important environmental issue is the disposal of phones and laptops and protecting animals. I want world leaders at COP26 to make a new way to dispose of phones and laptops. I also want to make a machine that can get all of the plastic out of the water to save the animals. So what we really liked about these quotes from the young people was that partly you could hear them repeating what we'd been talking about in sessions, so the disposal of things, you could hear that this was something they'd heard and they were saying, but mixing that with their own ideas about, right, I'm going to create this big machine that's going to suck all the rubbish out of the sea. So I really liked that, hearing that come back through their own words. And as I said, I'll put those links up there. That's where we are with it at the moment. There's so much more to do. We're desperate to get back into schools as soon as we can, and we're finding that changes from council to council and even school to school. So that's the big challenge for us just now, and trying to get back that full creativity that we found we had when you're actually in a classroom with people. Another big challenge for us is navigating the maze of who decides what in education in Scotland, and that might be an interesting talking point later on, but we would really love to have learning like this embedded into the curriculum and make it something that all children get an opportunity to do. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Matt has to say, because I think programmes like that are just so essential, and having something like that available for all children. But we found it difficult to navigate between Zero Waste Scotland, Education Scotland, Scottish Government, and kind of know who does what and where those decisions are made. So that's something that we would really like to develop. And then our last sort of challenge on that is funding this. It's really, really hard to fund it. So that's a big part of our work, is trying to raise the money to be able to do it. And we just do it because we think it's really, really important to do. We get such great feedback from children and teachers when it happens. And we just want to keep on making circles for as long as we can. Thank you very much. And yeah, any questions I'd love to answer.
So much. That's brilliant. Really loved it. And I'm getting an echo, I don't know why. I hope nobody else is.
Because of me.
And I think I love particularly that balance you've got between the small steps and the big picture. That idea of giving people a sense of empowerment, but at the same time not allowing them to think that that's enough, and I think real strength in that. Bianca Peel, who's been great in the chat line, was asking more specifically about the context of the workshops. I'm not sure, Bianca, whether or not Mary's already covered most of the information that you want. Bianca clearly active in a number of other ways. So Bianca, if you want more information, just come back in the chat and we'll come back to Mary on it. Otherwise, Mary, I'm going to now move on and introduce our second catalyst, who's Matt Robinson. Matt's a star. He is an absolutely brilliant trainer. He's a hugely energetic presence, and he's now the director of Learning Through Landscape Scotland, which used to be Grounds for Learning. I was involved in Matt's appointment, and my only concern was that in gaining what I thought was going to be a really, really good director, we might lose a hugely dynamic influence in the training programme that Learning Through Landscapes was running at that stage. I came across Matt, we were both working in the same venue, and I was just so pleased to see the reach that we were establishing across the UK. And Matt, I think, is representing an organisation which for me has been absolutely the front runner in outdoor education for years. And I'm only just a wee bit biased because I only used to be a trustee of it. I'm not anymore, and I'm still as big a fan and supporter. I really wanted Matt to be part of this conversation because I see outdoor education as absolutely central to what we're trying to do with young people around the climate emergency and environmental awareness. One of the students that we worked with had this brilliant quote: "I don't think that you can just sit in a classroom and be taught how to save the planet or whatever. You have to actually get out there and learn what needs to be done and how to do it." And I think that's at the heart of so much of what Learning Through Landscape does. But as well as the work they've been doing over a period of time, I know, Matt, that you've been particularly active around COP26. So just to hand over to you to take us through what it is you do, what the organisation does, and what you've been doing around COP. Welcome, Matt Robinson.
Thank you. What an introduction. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I'll just share a little bit more about our organisation and maybe what we've been doing recently and what we're taking forward with COP26. So Learning Through Landscapes has been around just over 30 years now. In Scotland, we were a partnership, and Learning Through Landscapes partnered with a bunch of local teachers, and we were the Grounds for Learning project of the Scottish Government, Scottish Executive, which gives you an age and quite a grand title. But predominantly our work is engaging young people with their school grounds, in having a say on how they're designed and how they're maintained, in making sure that those school grounds, the place where they spend 20% of their school life, actually has a really significant benefit to them, and that's both in formal learning time and informal learning time, better known as break time. And therefore our influence there is it's about kind of teaching practice and attitudes, probably more than design of spaces, although we do stray into that regularly, and we started off as a project with landscape architects at the heart for design of school grounds. Lots of the work we've been doing is very much about equipping teachers with the confidence and the resources they need to use the outdoors. And again, sometimes just making a lot of teachers realise that actually outdoors is just a very simple, straightforward place to teach and to learn, and it's part of good teaching and learning. I think a lot of people, when you start talking about outdoor learning, have visions of mountain tops and rivers and remote wild places, and a lot of our work is very curricular linked. It's maths. We're doing estimation. Well, why aren't you going outside and estimating how big the building is and working how much paint you need to repaint that door? Why aren't we going out and identifying what biodiversity we've got in our school grounds and writing poems on that beautiful, frosty, cold, grey October morning ready for Halloween? There's some real simple links that we work with. really passionate about kind of first-hand experience and using that better whole body experience of learning that is outdoors, to feel that sharp frost, to see the mist, and actually get a sense of writing, for example, that Halloween story better or something like that. Lots of effort into kind of co-consulting, co-design, consulting of young people about how they use their grounds, how they'd like it maintained. One of our ongoing issues there, and I'll come back to this with one of our projects in a moment, is around children not feeling any agency. It's not our school grounds, it belongs to the management company. I couldn't possibly plant a tree there because I'm not allowed to plant a tree. Well, the message is it's not your grounds and it's not your tree, and you shouldn't bother asking such a question. And I think that comes back to a lot of the spaces that we have for our children. To quote Nelson Mandela, you know, nothing shows the kind of heart of a nation than the spaces it reserves for its children. And if you walked into the average school grounds, what would you see? You know, would it be flat tarmac, concrete spaces, some flat mown grass desert, and a very expensive 3G picture or mugger in the middle? It doesn't necessarily give a message of nature and biodiversity. And even when children do want to do something about that and improve the spaces that they've got for learning and play, and teachers, often there's quite a challenge to get those spaces changed, to find the budget. With lots of school buildings, schools, estates, there's a lot of money goes into our shiny new buildings or our renovations, and very often the last thing to be done is the outdoor space. And therefore, if the budget's been overspent on the windows, guess what doesn't get built? And it's quite depressing. Some of the sort of worst looking school grounds photos I've got are some of our newest schools, and they're really quite depressing because they did spend it on the windows instead of the outdoor space, and the money isn't ring fenced. We also have a belief that access to outdoors, nature for play and learning needs to be something that's equitable as well. And that's everything from the school that you attend, the background you come from, to your race, and all sorts of other things that we're working on. So again, I think there's a big change at the moment to make sure that we really are truly inclusive, and we really are being careful about how we promote, how we engage young people, and make sure that they've got role models, they've got access, they've got people using language and behaviours that they relate to. And I think we've got a real issue. If I look at my background, which was, as well as teaching, was working in outdoors centres, I would probably turn around and say I was 80% male on my staff, and I was probably 99.9% white. And I think there's a real issue there. That's kind of outdoor centres, but I think that's something as LTL we're really working on at the moment, is to look into that kind of equity and inclusivity really strongly. I think our other passion is that these things should be kind of embedded, and they should be something that young people can relate to. One of the projects we've just been working on, called My School, My Planet, I'll put a link in the chat in a moment to it, was engaging young people with their school grounds as a vehicle for engaging in wider climate change, biodiversity issues that young people often found quite difficult to engage with. One of the real surprises of the last project that we ran, of the 49 schools that took part, only 7 had pupils who opted to do something on climate change. And was the message, I'm not interested? Or was the message, I can't do anything, therefore why should I engage? Or was the message something different that we weren't hearing about? And actually, by the end of the project, where children had got involved in projects to do with planting plants, studying soils, some of our other projects with Erasmus, studying things like air quality and noise, things that children could actually influence, then all of a sudden their engagement, their understanding, their relating to those wider issues came through, and we saw huge change in children's attitudes and engagement about it. And again, for us, we had a clear message there that you can't teach about these things, you have to do these things. As Mary was just highlighting before, you actually have to get stuck in and make these things happen to engage with some young people, and actually to engage all young people in that practical action, not just protest or not just learning about it, had a much deeper impact than we expected. I think I'm nearly about done talking about us. As we go into COP, one of the things that we challenged ourselves to talk about as an organisation was exactly this: how can we get children to engage in, I guess, local and immediate environment to their schools, but in a way that actually they felt some agency and authenticity in it. So for COP, we've come up with a series of kind of hack challenges for various ages, and these go from early years right through to secondary. And from early years, it may be something as simple as discussion with young children about what they like to do with, say, a tree in their nursery grounds, and what impact that tree has, and how could they have more of that. And that might be at a very simple level of, we want more plants in our school grounds. If you're a secondary school student, one of our challenges is that there's maybe poor air quality. And actually, how can you improve that air quality in your school grounds when you're right next to a business or a road that's polluting the airs around you and having an impact on your friend's asthma or something like that? So we've tried to come up with a series of hacks that could happen through a week with a teacher. You could pick it up as a short lesson or a running theme each morning, say in primary school or something like that. And our idea is that children can actually relate to these, and they can actually impact, and they could actually do some of this stuff rather than being the things that they can't action. I think one of my examples of that is my own son's school here in Scotland has recycling bins. Wonderful. Apart from when you see the janitor go and put them all in the same bin, included in the general waste, because the school does not have the funding for the recycling to pay for the 5 different bins being collected. So the message to the children there is, you can do all you want, but we're not going to do anything about it. And so our hacks were really aimed fundamentally at what could you influence, what could you come out of COP26 going, not only have I kind of had my voice heard, but I could do something in my school grounds, my own garden, the local park, and things like that. So that's us. We're a school grounds charity, but hey, I've just suddenly been talking about inclusivity, climate change, much bigger things. Yeah, passing on to the next person, I think, David.
Thank you so much. And I mean, Matt did all the things that I said he would do. And he also bigged up an organisation, which I still think is a huge role to play. I loved all the things, Matt, that you managed to get in there about the whole idea of experiential learning, about how experience brings depth, how it brings motivation. I love your comment about a whole body approach. I just thought that was just great. You got so much into that, and I'm really grateful to you for that, and also grateful to you for posting the link in the chat, and I hope people will take advantage of that. And not only did you do all of that, but you also gave perfect links into our next creative catalyst, whom I'm absolutely over the moon, I have to say, to have on board. We've got Scarlett Westbrook joining us. Scarlett does a huge amount of work, but what she also does is she makes me question what the flip I've been doing with my life. You know, actually, I think you can just about reverse my age and get Charlotte's. It's as bad as that. Charlotte has been an incredible activist. She's written a huge number of articles. It's really worth going online, checking out the amount that she's written and done, and some absolutely superb pieces. She is the youngest person in the entire world to hold an A level in government and politics. She just kind of randomly picked that up when she was 13. It was a brief gap between cleaning her teeth and plaiting her hair, I don't know. But she got an A level in government and politics when she was 13. So the word prodigy immediately springs to mind. But what she's done is she's made a huge commitment to the schools campaign, so much so that I think Scarlett was one of the activists that was identified to meet with Greta Thunberg when Greta Thunberg was here, and I'm sure that was a great honour for Greta. So just absolutely brilliant, Scarlett, to have you with us. What I've asked Scarlett to do is to give us the voice of young people, to tell us what's in the mind of young activists like herself, and also what her expectations and demands, if you like, are of the education system and of schools and teachers. So with due humility, Scarlett, I'm passing over to you. I'm going to cry for a bit now. Okay, Scarlett, take it over.
Hi everyone, my name's Scarlett Westbrook and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today. So I'm a journalist, and I'm also head of political engagement at Teach the Future, which is a student-led campaign to reform the education system to centre it around climate justice education. And I'm also the policy lead for the UK Student Climate Network, which is the organisation behind the school climate strikes, which I'm sure you'll remember. At our peak, we had 450,000 people strike school for climate and also strike work on the 20th of September 2019, 2 years ago. But we've continued striking since and had, I think, I don't know the total number, but quite a few thousand people also join us a few weeks ago. So part of the solution to the climate crisis is ensuring that the next generation are equipped with the knowledge and skills idiosyncratic to understanding what the climate crisis means and what the possible solutions are, so that we can build a resilient society that can deal with the now inevitable effects of the climate crisis, as well as a climate resilient economy that has a well-equipped workforce to go along with it. As climate change is going to affect everyone, whether they're a builder or a banker, a farmer or a pharmacist, climate education must be intertwined into every subject in a way that's accessible to everyone rather than just more content to memorise for exams. Although I'm 17, I've experienced all levels of mandatory education in England, from nursery right up to A-levels. As when I was 13, I became the youngest person in the world to have an A-level in government and politics, which I self-taught and specialised in climate and education policy for. And this also gives me a unique insight into how our education system works, because I got to teach myself the subject matter rather than have a teacher teach it to me in the way that's, state obligated. So my experience of climate education is really limited, and I'm one of the lucky few people who got to study the environmental legislation unit of A-level politics before it was scrapped, completely taken out from the subject. Despite taking all subjects that have the faintest memory of climate change, geography, chemistry and physics, I, as well as all students in England and Wales and Northern Ireland, and even in Scotland, if people who don't take, I think it's called RMPS, obviously teachers get to choose what they teach there. So some students in Scotland won't know this either. The social and economic repercussions about climate change or what the possible solutions look like. We also aren't taught about how we will be affected in a more personal capacity. So from what I've learned in school, it's easy for me to believe that climate change is a far off issue of the future, only going to affect the so-called global south, not really going to have anything to do with me, when we know that's definitely not the case. Recent examples being the climate change induced floods throughout the UK a few weeks ago, and so many other disasters affecting us here, but also across the world. And this limited provision of climate education is really shocking. The fact that we're removing the climate crisis from the curriculum rather than increasing its presence is incredibly disconcerting. So in research we found in Teach the Future, which surveyed students aged around 11 to 18, we found that only 4% of students surveyed felt like they had adequate knowledge about the climate crisis. And this is coming from the generation that started the school strikes that have brought the climate crisis to the media's attention. You'd expect that we, out of anyone, would be really knowledgeable about this, but that's not the case. And that's because we need systemic reform, not just curriculum change. We need to ensure climate education is no longer exclusive to those who take optional subjects where it's briefly glazed over, but centred in all subjects, as the climate crisis is interdependent with the subject matter itself. And we must liberate the climate crisis from science. I'm an aspiring medical student. I've just sent off my UCAS application today, so I understand the importance of STEM. But in real terms, when we talk about things like limiting global heating to 2 degrees, for most people 2 degrees isn't enough to change what clothes you're wearing when you go outside. If it's a 2 degrees dip, you're not going to bring a jumper with you. It's really hard to imagine how that's going to bring the planet to pretty much existential collapse, and we need to make sure that we acknowledge that in our curriculum and use all of the different subjects we have, the arts, the humanities, the sciences, to bring a really real and understandable picture of what climate change will look like, what we can do to avert and mitigate its impact, and so much more. And doing this systemically also means that academies and independent schools will receive the provisions that we're proposing here, so that all young people receive the idiosyncratic education needed to understand our current social, environmental and economic climate. We also believe that climate education should be extended to include knowledge about how to stop and abate the climate emergency and ecological crisis, deliver climate justice, and provide support for students to deal with eco and climate anxiety. something which climate education will also mitigate, as students will be empowered with the information to tackle this issue. So there was a report published really recently showing that growing numbers of young people are experiencing eco-anxiety or climate anxiety, with words like climate grief also included. And from all of the research and discourse around this currently, it's really individualized almost to a few sensitive young people, when actually it's the product of systemic failure from the government, who are refusing to act on this crisis, which they have the political and economic capacity to fix. So, not only is climate action abating climate anxiety, but so is climate education, because we're denied this education to understand this really real and scary problem that we're seeing implications of around us. I feel like understanding exactly what it means and what can still be done to mitigate it will really empower young people to take a stand. And also on this same topic, in my experience of climate education, the first time I ever learned about the climate crisis was, I was probably about 5, and I had to write about my own carbon footprint. The carbon footprint was something that was popularized by BP, one of the biggest emitters in the world. So by the time most of us have learned about the climate crisis, we've spent years thinking it's our fault. Maybe if we switch the lights off a bit more, if we, I don't know, recycled something, so chucking it away, we wouldn't be in a climate disaster, climate emergency, when actually we know it's 100 companies that are responsible for 71% of emissions. We know that 70% of flyers take up 15% of flyers take up 70% of flights, and the majority of those are inside our own country, traveling from London to Manchester, plane, via train. So we need to make sure that in our education system, we flip that narrative around. There's lots we can do as individuals to, take a stand against the climate crisis. But ultimately, it's a systemic problem, and we need to stop shifting that systemic blame onto children and onto regular consumers who aren't those 100 companies or those big fossil fuel corporations. And also, not only is our curriculum one that endorses and perpetuates racist and prejudiced narratives, but it also maintains a grotesque power imbalance that only serves to discriminate against those who are less privileged. The power imbalances in education and in our society are replicated by climate change. When I'm talking about power imbalances here, I'm talking about, the historic neglect of children with special educational needs and disabilities, also how people of colour, students of colour, are disproportionately excluded and barred from education. We really need to make sure that our education system is more accessible, because especially as we're seeing increasing numbers of students being diagnosed with neurodivergencies or other special educational needs, we can't really stick to this, one size fits all approach of a teacher at a PowerPoint just going on. I think in terms of climate, particularly if you're in a school in an inner city building like I go to, you're going to be surrounded by concrete everywhere, and it's hard to really connect with nature and the climate crisis if all you're used to seeing is tower blocks, which is the case for a large proportion of children growing up currently in the UK. I know from my primary school personally, we got to visit the local allotments every week, which I think was a really valuable experience. And I also think in a lot of these cases, we can just dig the concrete up and replace them with communal gardens for children to work on. That's also something my own primary school did. A normal state primary school, inner city Birmingham, quite poor because Tory government. But I think that was really valuable, and it's definitely something we can do. We need to really take an interdisciplinary approach to climate education, and obviously teachers are limited a lot by funding and by Ofsted and by exam boards, but that doesn't have to be the case, and we do have the opportunity and the capacity to change that. We just need our government to put those steps in. In the run-up to COP, we really need to level up our climate policy provisions, and there's no better place to start than the reform of our education system. We can go further than just changing the education system. We could make those students who are studying these reformed construction and apprenticeships in plastering and that sort of stuff to lead the way to decarbonising their own schools. If you're learning about infrastructure and construction, why not like actually hands-on take part in that? We need all of our education buildings to be net zero by 2030 in line with the IPCC report. Why don't we not only create new green jobs for thousands of workers already in construction, but let those students studying at those places to do that with them? You know, if you're learning about, I don't know, like insulation, you could go and insulate your school too with these workers who have gotten jobs now because of this public sector decarbonisation, and learn with them. And I think that's also really valuable and something we really need to explore more, because we need to stop confining education to textbooks, especially in the cases of practical subjects. Democracy, by definition, means power of the people, and there's no better way to empower young people than providing us with the education necessary to live in a world increasingly impacted by the climate crisis. In our research, we found that 68% of students want to know more about the climate crisis. So we should use this enthusiasm to pave the way towards a curriculum that centres the climate. With a transformative education system that's fit for the 21st century, we can prepare the next generation of workers for the workforce and economy that we'll inherit, whether that's introducing climate apprenticeships in the renewable energy sector, or expanding vocational courses so that they cover sustainability, or changing academic content to give us a realistic idea of our world and subjects in their climate impacted context. By doing this, we're not only going to create a skilled workforce, but we can create thousands of green jobs, as I previously mentioned, and also set a precedent for the rest of the world and also for children. If you're in a school that's very climate focused, that's net zero, you're going to take that with you throughout the rest of your life and continue that in whatever you grow up to do. And we can also follow in the footsteps of countries like Italy, which have announced an extra hour per week of climate education. Although that hour per week is just one block of climate education, we'd prefer if it was intertwined through every single subject instead of something to dread because you have to stay back for an extra hour a week, and I don't think anyone will like that. We really urgently need to see the introduction of embedded climate education and reform the teacher training qualification so that teachers are well prepared to deliver climate education, something that's not currently done, even for teachers in sciences. 70% of teachers feel like they haven't received adequate training to educate students about climate change, and that figure only increases when we take it out of its scientific context. So by putting in changes now, we can work towards a greener present whilst working towards a better future, ensuring that we create the green economy and green workers of the future that we desperately need. And I know I've mentioned workers a lot. Disabled people are also going to be part of this green economy. The care sector is one of the most carbon intensive of all sectors, which is really surprising. You know, you wouldn't think it would be so carbon intensive, but actually because of the need to use single-use plastics, having to drive between each care placement and that sort of stuff, it also makes it a really carbon intensive sector, ensuring that disabled people are in our approach to this, working with disabled students to see if they could even come up with solutions or adapt to technology that's better for the planet, making sure we support those access needs and making sure everybody's involved in this green education system, green economy, green workforce and green society. I'm going to see if there's any questions. Sorry. Yeah, I definitely think that there's a place for holistic learning in climate education. I go to a girls' grammar school, which is really, really academic, as you can imagine, not very holistic. But I do think looking back to primary school, where we spent lots of time building a garden, going to allotments and that sort of stuff, really sort of set a precedent for the work I do now, which is being really engaged with the climate. If I'm completely honest, I don't really like nature. I'm allergic to grass. I'm really scared of most animals, not really a fan, but I think having that opportunity has, you know, sort of shown me that even if I don't personally like spending time out here, it's still important. It's still something we need to be connected to. And my own personal views shouldn't, you know, take priority over the livelihoods of everybody. And I think that's something, you know, that's kind of selflessness almost. It's something that we need to communicate across the children. And I also think that being caved up in a tiny classroom with 30 other people isn't good for anyone, especially with the current sort of learning we have, which is, you know, teachers are trying their best, but ultimately it's hard to learn if you're just being told stuff off of PowerPoint, and your own personal learning style is different. Maybe you're more of a visual learner, maybe you want to talk more to people. And I think that obviously there's lots of barriers being posed by the government's lack of funding, by lack of teachers also, and all of this sort of stuff. But if we have the political will, we could actually implement this, and that could be so cool. I'm sorry, I'm just reading through the chat simultaneously. I'm not great at multitasking.
That's okay, Charlotte. You don't need to worry about that. You've done more than anyone could have asked from you. We started off with the circular economy, and what we've had is a circular conversation, because every single theme that's been picked up by any of the three of you has been amplified by at least one of the others, and usually both. And that's just been absolutely fantastic. You talked, Scarlett, about the concrete playgrounds and all of that. And one of the things that Learning Through Landscapes do is highlight playgrounds exactly like that, which have been completely revitalized, often with very simple approaches, raised gardens, putting in unstructured play. There are huge opportunities for that. I don't know whether we still do it, Matt, but we used to do a tour of schools like that so that people could go and see them live. I mean, that has just been an incredible example of how integrated the approach needs to be, and the way that each of these contributions coming in from slightly different angles have all come together so perfectly. That's just been an absolute joy, and I hope other people have appreciated that. So the opportunity's there. We don't have questions coming up in the chat at the moment. Delighted if we do get some, and we'll certainly pick them up and put them into the conversation. People have also got a raise the hand facility, so if anybody wants to contribute live, and that includes our contributors, they're good at contributing. So if anybody wants to come in live, just raise your hand, and Matt's already done that, and we'll take you in. Could I just say to people that if anyone else comes on, this conversation will be being recorded. It is being recorded, and we will put it up on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be recorded, don't come in live, put your question in the chat. Matt.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on that whole thing. We were talking about kind of moving from eco-anxiety to action. And again, this is a lot of the work that we do with schools. And I think my view on it is this, that actually when we sit down and talk with young people, they're immediately engaged. They can alter their space. They really would like that. I think teachers are motivated. They're engaged. They want to do something. The hard work of this actually comes down to the people who do things like manage our buildings and our green space. So yes, we need training and support for teachers. Yes, we need to put the lessons in there and embed them with young people. But actually there's a real practicality here that says the people who get the contract every 5 years to mow the school grounds, we need to work with them. The guy who pushes that mower around the grounds, that's the person I need to talk to. The reason I say that, again, we've had practical examples of a head teacher sprinting down to the far end of the school grounds because somebody in a mower was mowing straight through the trees that the pupils had just planted because they weren't on the map. So why wouldn't you do it? You're paid to do it. And I think we run into some real practicalities here beyond children's passion and interest, beyond the training and support and professionalism of teachers, that becomes everybody involved in this has their part to play, and therefore we've got a radical change, and it is things like the contracts around our school buildings and grounds, green spaces, things like that, where people need to be under pressure and measured, not just the users of the service saying, I would like this change and we'd like to grow more trees in our school grounds. As a very simple basis to start these things.
Mary actually raised her hand. She didn't even need to use the technology. Mary, in you come.
Can't find the right button. Just to say, I totally agree with that, Matt. And we had exactly the same experience looking at how we were trying to create a circular classroom. How could you cut waste out of a classroom? So we did a kind of life in the day, and we came up against that so many times because who orders the stationery? Where do the school lunches come from? Everything's done through different people. So some of it comes down to the teacher, some of it comes down to the school, some of it comes down to the council, some of it comes down to, and trying to kind of navigate your way through that, especially when you're not a teacher or in a school, is really, really hard. So it's actually very difficult to yeah, there needs to be some sort of mapping, I think, of who decides what, who makes those decisions, and then seeing how you can embed that right through to the guy mowing the lawn or the person ordering the packed lunches. And yeah.
To come back with something more positive, we are working with schools, and we've had the privilege of working with some other schools who are managing to make those changes. You know, a couple of schools are particularly privileged. They're private or international schools, but we have got schools and organisations that are working towards, you know, reducing plastics through working with the kitchen and saying, why have we got disposable anything in the school, and things like that. So I think it can be done. As David said, we can change the spaces, and we have a model for doing that, and wilding up school grounds and changing the biodiversity and therefore the climate impact. So there is good news. I don't want to be completely negative. But, you know, the theme of this discussion was, is it easy? And the answer is, it's easy to get engaged and get passionate. It's actually quite sticky and dirty and muddy to action that and make it happen over the next few years.
There's a lovely example of one of the schools that Grounds for Learning worked with, which was Stirling High School. And the driving force in Stirling High School was one of the lab technicians in the school. And it was through her that the dynamism came. And I think there's something really powerful in the comments that you're both making about how this needs to be cultural change, and that means the culture of schools as well. So valuable lessons, I think, for colleagues in terms of who we reach out to when we have these conversations. Ruth Mackay's made a really good point in the chat about how little time teachers have actually got out with classes to reflect, to think, and to have these conversations. And hopefully that's something that's going to be picked up on. It's certainly one of the recommendations from the OECD report on Scottish education, that class contact is too high. People don't have the time to think, to reflect, and to engage with others. And I love the idea that there are small steps that can be taken, but they need to be taken, you know, and again, that's the critical point from Matt. Anyone else want to come in at all? I'm not seeing any hands raised apart from contributors. Anyone else want to come in, or any questions that anyone's got at this stage? Angus Murdoch's got his hand up.
Hi, I work in waste and cleansing. I'm technical coordinator, which means I deal with strategy and policy in the waste and cleansing service. So it's quite interesting because actually in Edinburgh we have the exact opposite problem, Matt, to what you described earlier, in that our schools do have the full recycling service available to them. It's what goes on inside the schools that's the problem. But that's not the school's fault either. It's not under their control, because it's all centralised. But there is work going on between ourselves and facilities to try and address that. But I did want to just mention that in Edinburgh we do have a schools programme of education, which, as Mary has highlighted, has had to be suspended in Edinburgh as well, unfortunately, because of COVID. But not in normal times, we do actually have workshops and things like that to try and address things like single-use plastics. And it's quite different to what Mary does. It's more focused around the actual waste itself, in terms of, you know, making sure people are doing things like putting stuff in the right bins and are not littering, things like that. So it's that kind of education. So they do have some craft-based activities, but it is quite different to what Mary's talking about. I just wanted to do a bit of an advert there, basically, shamelessly.
Yeah, good. And I think that's it. We have got good news. I think, as David just said, this is culture change. And at the end that you've just described, where actually there's some pupils and staff in school still to work with, or at the other end, the local authority that will remain nameless that we've been working with, you know, to persuade them to do the recycling. It's culture change time, and it gets sticky and quite awkward at times. To give you an idea of how awkward some of these discussions can be, the grass mowing example I used before, part of the reason being that we now pay people to not cut the grass because they had a contract for 5 years to cut the grass, and if I cancel that contract or reduce it, then they're out of pocket. So because of the contracts that we've got, we're currently paying people to not play the grass. But it just shows you the challenge we've got. I think the good news is, though, and Scarlett was on about this, you know, the creativity of pupils to kind of work through these problems and get stuck in and say we can help. And great to hear people like Edinburgh are actually fully recycling and offering that. So
I think it's just, if I may just pick up on the point that Angus made as well, I think one of my big concerns, and it ties into the comment that Ruth Mackay made in the chat, is that, you know, people are just too busy drowning to reach for the life belts. And, you know, Angus helpfully comes up with the initiative in Edinburgh that so many people probably aren't aware of, don't know that they could join into, and it's about how we can create that space for people to find the time to engage. Sorry, Mary, I cut across you.
No, not at all. I was just going to say, Angus, what's the name of that programme?
So that is, it's actually delivered by a third sector organisation called ChangeWorks.
Okay.
And they've got changeworks.org.uk. Traditionally they've done activities like doing workshop topic, but one of the downsides of that is the work doesn't necessarily get, the outcomes don't necessarily get embedded. They're popular at the time, but they don't necessarily drive behavioural change. So they've changed focus just gradually over the last couple of years to do what they call a whole school approach. So that's much more intensive, working with, for example, partners like the catering service to try and tackle single-use plastic bottles or single-use Tetra Packs, it actually is in Edinburgh, I believe, now, and things like that. Working with the sort of school managers, but also with the other facilities teams like the cleaners and so on, that the schools don't directly control, to try and affect change. Because that is one of the big frustrations, I think. I mean, I shouldn't really speak for the schools, but I think that is one of the frustrations, that you know, they don't control these things themselves necessarily, or don't have full control over it, or the extent to which they control it is maybe down to the individuals that are working in their school. And that's an issue across our estate, I think.
I think that's really interesting, and that's where, when you're saying the whole school approach, I think is so important, because you need that kind of training and learning around, right, how to recycle properly, but at the same time you need to be doing, we're sort of starting at the other end where it's, right, how could you design stuff so differently that you never need to recycle?
So design it out.
Yeah, and so I think you need both of those at the same time. You need to have, right, how can we rethink our whole system and not just tinker at the edges? But until that's done, how can we make sure that we're doing the best we can with what we have and the system we're living in? So it all needs to happen, but how that happens is the big question.
Well, I think what's encouraging in response to Angus's comment is that schools are speaking for themselves, and there's lots now coming in the chat about practical things that people are doing around recycling and single-use plastic. There's a really interesting appeal coming in about stopping us talking so much about recycling and starting us to talk more about reduction, which I think is a really useful point. And there's an absolutely wonderful comment from Jill Proctor, which I would encourage everyone to go into the chat and read. A really long, thoughtful comment, which contains a whole number of interesting ideas and sidelines. And I just really think it's important to see how much people are already doing and building on, which is really the point that Matt's been making very strongly as we've gone through this, that there are platforms. And I think one of the things that we need to keep coming back to is your starting point, which I love, Mary, about big picture, small actions. We need to be aware of what it takes to change the world, but we also need to change our own. And I think that's something that's been pretty warmly welcomed by colleagues in the chat. Does anyone else at this stage want to come in, either directly by raising their hand or coming in the chat line? There's a quote in from Patrick Boxall, who's a great friend of the Creative Conversations. He's talking about work that's going on in Queen Margaret University, and he's provided a link to that as well. So, you know, lots coming in, I think. Also, another point coming in from Ruth, a significant issue with food outlets close to schools, still using and a failure, I think, to really come to grips with the totality of the changes and challenges we need to make. Either of you who can see both of Mary and Matt, but Charlotte, any of you want to come back in at this stage with any comments on what you're seeing and hearing from the chat?
I think the only other point we would make, and I would say this is the school grounds charity, is that looking for places and spaces that young people can influence. And again, we've done some projects, one of which remains in planning because the organisation that did it realised that when we were talking about plastics, it was something the children didn't feel they could influence massively some of the choices over plastics or some of the choices over transport. If your parents need to take you to school and it's too far to go, you often get driven or you go on the bus or whatever. So I think there is something there about making sure when we're looking at some of these things, the places and spaces we take action are the places and spaces really close and personal to the children and young people. We worked on an Erasmus project doing just this called Bioprofiles, and it was looking at those biodiversity, climate crisis topics, but absolutely in the local neighbourhood that the children were, but also ones they could actually influence. And I think that's really important, those small bites, again, another practicality.
And I think what you're talking about a lot, Matt, as you go through this, is learning agency, which was one of the points that Mary made.
Exactly.
How vitally important it was for people to establish a sense of agency. It's that wonderful quote about, if I'm going to move the world, I need a place to stand, and people need to have that sense of effectiveness and agencies.
I think there's a sense of possibly uncertainty as well, David. Doing some of these things, and they might not be perfect. You know, we might try and grow a load of stuff in school, and one year it might fail. We might plant some trees and they might not grow, or we might try something, we might not get anywhere with our improved recycling or reducing journeys to school. And I think we need to also move to an acceptance that we need to try, but we're not always going to be 100% successful or have a fixed outcome. And I think a lot of education is about a fixed outcome. You will know this knowledge and you will move to this stage. And I think a lot of the projects we're talking about are a little more uncertain in their outcome. Will they be successful?
Yeah, absolutely. Scarlett, if you're still there, I wonder if I might bring you back in. I'd be interested to know whether you're encouraged by what you're hearing in the conversation and maybe what you're seeing in the chat.
Yeah, it's definitely really exciting to see so many educators passionate about climate education, and there's definitely some really, really good ideas in the chat. I think, if anything, I'm just frustrated that the government is preventing more of this from happening, or for this to be more widespread or in depth, which is why we have to keep lobbying, I guess. I can put in our email template for Teach the Future, which is everything I was speaking about earlier. Education reform, was mentioning a lot of the things that lots of others here have covered. I can't find our website, 1 second, sorry. But it's definitely really promising and exciting to see that so many people are really passionate about this.
I was just going to ask, because it was interesting when, Scarlett, you were talking earlier about your experience of school in England, and one of the things that I really liked when I started working with teachers on our programme and with Lorna was that the curriculum for excellence in Scotland seems really well suited to this, because it is cross-curricular. It's all about learning right across the curriculum rather than having everything in its little silos. But I wonder how we can do more of that. You know, I wonder, it did feel to me when you were talking, Scarlett, that it felt like maybe it had been even harder in a, and I don't know if this is right or not, but in an English educational setting where it's not the curriculum for excellence, maybe that was a bit more difficult. But how can we make it better? How can we get that cross-curricular learning? Who decides that we can put this into the curriculum as something that has to be there for, you know, who decides how it can be embedded and how that happens? And that's where I find it difficult. It's such a maze to know who makes these decisions and how can we influence them to make it happen.
So a lot of it in England especially is shaped by the Department for Education. So we've just had a new education secretary come in, and he'll probably be steering some changes, and they kind of work with other companies. I wouldn't be surprised if they work with fossil fuel companies, if I'm completely honest, just based on some of the things they've said to me. and kind of shape it with teachers, the civil service, of course, from the Department for Education, and so many others. And from there, they create that top-down structure. I think there's definitely in Scotland a lot more autonomy for teachers to teach about things that aren't just prescriptive, in things like RMPS and also cross-curricular learning, like you said. However, I do think that there's more freedom for teachers to use their own material years 7 to 9. I think that's S1 to about 2. Yeah, S1, S2, because you're not doing GCSEs or national 5s. I think in those years, if it's something like in English, if you're looking at someone's account of fleeing from the climate crisis, instead of, I don't know, a book from some like dead old white man from 200 years ago, if in drama you were looking at like a piece about how the climate crisis is affecting people in their lives now, if in history you're looking at things like the Industrial Revolution, which we know is why we have the climate crisis today at the scale that it is, if we do that sort of stuff in those younger years and in primary school too, I think that's definitely a good way of getting that cross-curricular link. I think because so much of our climate education is in like sciencey framing, it almost becomes really difficult to think of how it will look in other contexts, but there's definitely lots of ways. Even in more like creative subjects, I know you mentioned drama, but in home economics or food tech, or whatever you call it, we can look at food chains and how they're going to be impacted by the climate crisis, how we need to be growing more locally, using more local resources. Like, for example, if you're vegan, you're going to have to ship in lentils from South America. Are those aviation costs bigger to the planet than having local meat would be? I don't know. Looking at stuff like that in school and looking at all of the different ways in which the climate crisis is going to impact that subject matter, that we know there's loads of ways. And I think we basically just need to be more imaginative and think outside of the curriculum and think outside of what's government mandated, and think about what our lives are realistically going to look like in the future and how we can best prepare students to do that. Which sounds, really basic here, but when you actually sort of think about it, because we're so used to thinking in the framework of the current education system, it's a bit difficult, but we can get there. So for me personally, I want to go into medicine, so I want to know in biology how vector pathways are going to change, so we're going to have more pandemics. I want to know about how in my GCSE food tech, my food supplies are going to be disrupted. In English, I want to know about how people on the front line of the climate crisis are feeling and look at how they use different ways to communicate, especially when things are translated, they obviously will take on a different meaning to their original language. And I think those original languages could be studied in language classes, from like German or French or Spanish speaking countries or whatever subject your school does. Just really looking at it as not a hypothetical, as we have done for so long in geography and physics, but as something that's affecting us right now.
But there's some brilliant comments coming in on the chat about this, because there is flexibility in Scotland for people to do more. The curriculum's less prescribed than it is in England. And an awful lot is about approaches. Karen Dorrit, who's made a couple of comments about home economics, nailing it totally in terms of how important that is as a subject, just in delivering concepts, not just techniques and knowledge, but delivering concepts around waste and usefulness. And sometimes it's just about seeing things through a different lens, and supporting that capacity. And Matt, I think, inevitably, of course, gave us a brilliant piece of advice on this in a totally different context, where he said, don't ask the question. He was talking about a different context, but he was saying, don't ask the question, that the opportunities are there. And there's some brilliant work being done. We've had Hal Roberts and Deborah Kidd on creative conversations before, both really, really good in looking at how you can navigate the curriculum to cover the concepts and the content, but also to bring in those other elements around it. And I think worth looking at that. Mary, sorry.
But no, it's great. So much to talk about. It's really exciting. I think it's great, more flexibility, and that teachers can do it. That's brilliant. But again, that puts the onus on them to know what to do, to be interested in it, to have the knowledge to do it. So how can we make sure further upstream that we're actually ensuring that happens? And that's the bit I still don't understand where that happens. You know, is that Scottish Government? Is it Education Scotland? Is it? And I don't know if anyone here in the audience has the answer to that, because it's that bit of, I think it's great that teachers can do it, but what we find when we go into schools is you've got some teachers doing loads and the kids are really passionate about it already and they understand it, but if you're not lucky enough to get a teacher like that, you don't get that knowledge. So how can we make sure it has to be part, in a way, take the flexibility?
That's a really good question. So there's a role for the UK-wide education secretary to play. So it's Nadeem Zahawi right now. There's currently a report being written by the Department for Education. I think it's called their Climate and Sustainability Charter, something like that. And then that will go to the devolved nations, so Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, to their education ministers, who can then do more. Education is pretty much completely devolved, as you already know. So most of this role here is in the Scottish Government, the Scottish Education Department's remit, basically. On the website that I put up earlier in the chat, that under the Scotland page, there's a template email that you can send to your is it Holly Road? Yeah. members of Scottish Assembly or Parliament. I'm really bad at the Scotland. I do mostly Northern Ireland and England, which will go more into depth on this. And all you have to do is just put in your name and your constituency, and it will send off that email to whoever's representing you in the Scottish Parliament. It's a lot of lobbying with this, and that lobbying has to be twofold. It can't just be to the Scottish Parliament, it has to be to the UK-wide government too, because they still have some power over the devolved nations in terms of education. And I definitely agree that this pressure shouldn't be on individual teachers to take this upon themselves, especially when they don't have adequate training or resources or time. I know being a teacher is already quite strenuous as it is, without having to teach yourself about the climate crisis and then look at how that's going to translate. And that means that we really need to lobby these governments to ensure that this is something that's part of the curriculum and not just an optional add-on, because the climate crisis isn't going to be optional to deal with. It's something we all have to deal with. Like how school is meant to prepare us for the workforce, it should also prepare us for the changed workforce, which is, going to be the result of the climate crisis. So basically just lobbying. The Teach the Future website is going to give you a lot more good information that's Scotland specific than I can, because I'm not great at Scotland.
Scarlett, can I dive in? Sorry, and just say one more. Just relating to teachers, one of my overused phrases when I'm training is "don't do more, do different." And I really believe that, if you look at this as a kind of cross-cutting thing, and Scarlett, you said it brilliantly ago, choose the books you're studying about, are these books that relate to kind of modern issues and climate change? Are we looking at the themes and topics and how we deliver them, rather than an addition to the curriculum? And a lot of the work we do with teachers is saying, don't do more, do it differently and use a different context. And I think there's something powerful that teachers get then.
And that's another really good note to begin to draw things together. I'm conscious that the numbers are dropping off and a number of people have had to go off to attend to other things. But an organisation like Learning Through Landscapes does a great deal in terms of sharing practice. I think one of the things that we could all be doing is putting pressures on the regional improvement collaboratives that we have in Scotland. As I keep saying, it sounds a bit like some Stalinist organisation left over from the Soviet Union in the 1930s, but they do brilliant work, and there's a real opportunity for them on the back of COP to make this a priority in terms of sharing and applying. I think one of the comments that's been made is about the amount of work that willing and interested teachers do. Are we doing enough to highlight and spread their practice? How many contributions were there at the Scottish Learning Festival? highlighting good practice around outdoor learning or climate change. You know, a lot of the time it's felt in Scotland as if Juliet Robertson was running alone ahead of the world, just telling us how we can take different approaches to maths, to language development, and publishing really helpful and useful books in that. And I continue to commend Juliet's books and her work. But I think what's come out of today is that the energy is there amongst young people, the demand is there amongst young people for change, the resources are there, and from the chat, some phenomenal commitments from colleagues. So thank you so much to everybody who's participated in the conversation, either as somebody attending and contributing, or somebody presenting and contributing. The standard tonight, I think, has just been amazing. I feel energized and inspired by it. So thank you very much. We've got another conversation, as we've said, coming up on the 28th, where we're looking at more resources and more support that's available to schools through Daydream Believers, Creative Bravery, and the Children's Parliament. And we hope that anyone who is here today will come back for that and tell their friends not to miss it. We will make sure that we publicise the recording of this, because I think people will have been very sorry when they know what they've missed. So thanks very much to everyone. Enjoy your evening.